Thank you. Thank you very much. Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to Threshold of Hope, where we try to go through some of the writings of the church. And today is a very special feast. You know, there was a lawsuit in which some atheists were contesting the public celebration of Christmas, which is a national holiday, as is Good Friday. And I said there's no equivalent kind of holiday for atheists, therefore we must stop the celebration of Christmas. And the judge said, well, actually, in Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, it does designate your feast, because it says there that the fool says that there is no God, therefore your feast is April 1st. So happy feast. Now, we are going through the document on faith and reason, Fides et Ratio. You can get a paperback copy from EWTN's Religious Catalog. Simply go to EWTNreligiouscatalog.com or call them 1-800-854-6316. You may also download a free electronic copy of Fides et Ratio by going to EWTN.com, go to the document library, and where it says encyclicals, just write in Fides et Ratio. It'll come right up, and you can download it for free into your computer and read it from your computer or print it out if you wish, but you have to pay for that. Of course, we'd love to have you be involved and participate in our show. One way is to come here to Birmingham, like these nice folks have done, mostly from the two Kansas cities in Missouri and Kansas, and other folks as well. Or you can also send us a question by writing to threshold@EWTN.com or call during our live broadcast. Now that's on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and adjust that to your own time zone. The number you can call is 1-800-221-9460. That's for North America. Outside North America, or if you're right here in Birmingham, simply call 205-271-2980. We are now on paragraph 56. And this is, dealing with some of the ways in which the church, and the magisterium in particular, has been dealing with various problems that show up from poor quality philosophy. And in this section, he said, there are signs today, and not today, it's even more common, signs of a widespread distrust of universal and absolute statements, especially from those who think that truth is born out of a consensus. Now, this is what we call relativism, and it is all over our country. People who assert very strongly and clearly there is no absolute truth. And again, this is something that's very illogical. To be a relativist is completely illogical, because when you say there is no absolute truth, of course, you are making yourself blind to the fact that you just made an absolute statement that you believe to be true. And you're saying that, there is no absolute truth. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? Usually they are, but they don't see the irony of being absolutely sure there is no absolute. And again, I like to always point out the reason that this is a problem is in their blindness to holding an absolute truth, that namely that there is no absolute truth. They don't see their own illogic. And they fail to see a key problem of relativism, which is that since I have my truth and you have your truth, We don't have any truth by which we can decide anything between us. What's in common? If there is no objective truth, what do we have in common? Nothing. Just our own opinions. And the Pope says that they just try to get a consensus. However, consensus is a nice sounding word. Basically, when you are a relativist, you have no choice but to have truth decided by power. In other words, for relativists, might makes right. We can't argue about it. We can't discuss it because we don't have enough truth in common. And then it becomes might makes right. So if I get the votes, if I get a judge to agree with me, if I get enough people on a poll, or if I beat you up, whatever works to get my opinion, because I think I'm right and you're wrong, and I can't convince you, so I will use power. That is what relativists are left with. And that's what makes relativists so dangerous. And they will also try to say, no, it's the people who hold to truth, especially Christians, who are the dangerous ones. They will try to accuse us of being the ones who are violent in promoting our doctrine. But, when you read Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, you see that he also held to a denial of absolute truth. And that once he got power, he used it to enforce his views. And he did not have any moral qualms against hurting everybody who disagreed with him, because there was no other truth except his. And you see some of the same kind of attitudes toward morality showing up in other totalitarian mentalities, because relativism ends up, I know that they are trying to avoid being totalitarian by saying there is no absolute, but they become totalitarians despite themselves. Whereas instead, we believe that there is an objective relationship between the mind, that is the human intellect, and the outside world. In other words, my mind is capable of knowing the outside world. It's not just something in my mind. It really is corresponding to the things around me. And that would be a Christian's basic assumption. Now, we live in a world that is subdivided into specialized fields. You go to the universities, and even within some of the departments, for instance, you can say, there's an engineering department. In some universities, it gets so specialized that the chemical engineers can't communicate as well with the electrical engineers, even though they're engineers. And this goes on in all kinds of fields. Everybody gets very, very specialized without being able to communicate within the fields. This goes on in a lot of areas. So that's why it's not hard to see how difficult it can be to acknowledge a full and ultimate meaning of life. If, even within a university where they should be doing a type of thinking that pulls things together, they instead become more and more divided into specialties. And that they can't even talk to people within their own general field so easily. This becomes something that makes philosophy difficult because, again, as we've said over and over, one of the goals of philosophy is to see the meaning of the whole of life, to pull it together and make sense out of life as a whole and not just my tiny little specialty. Nonetheless, in the light of faith, which looks to Jesus Christ and sees in Jesus Christ the ultimate meaning of life. He's the one who is the light shining in the darkness of the world. He's the one who shows what is right and wrong and why. He's the one who even gives a meaning to human suffering and a hope for everlasting life. Jesus Christ is the one who can take us to ultimate meaning. And therefore, the Pope encourages all philosophers, whether the philosophers are Christians or whether they're not Christians, that they should trust in the power of human reason. Use the human mind. And don't set your goals too low. Well, I want to, this is one of the things that happens in some areas of life. I want to be the best person who understands the sex life of a moth. Now, some of you are laughing, aren't you? How many of you ever heard of Alfred Kinsey, who did the Kinsey Report on male sexuality in the 1940s? That's what he did his PhD in, the sex life of the moth. And understandably, he got bored. Wouldn't take long for me. And so then he became interested and got everybody else interested in human sexuality, but his model was not the wisdom of what is distinctively human, but he tried to show that everybody is like the animals, which is still a common theme in today's world. That you are no different from the animals in your sexual urges. That's why teenagers are all, I'm tired of hearing this, that they're full of raging hormones. I've seen teenagers rage, but hormones just sort of travel through the bloodstream. They're minding their own business, doing what they're supposed to do. Teenagers might rage, but hormones are fine. So it's a dumb image. But it becomes a way of saying they can't control themselves, so we'll just give them permission and ways to keep it safe, which they don't. So, this is why we don't want to set too low a bar for what philosophy should do. We want very much to have people seek the deeper meaning of life, the meaning of what it is to be human. We are not just like the moths or the other animals. We bring another quality. What is it that gives us something different from the animals? What makes us similar to them? What makes us different? These are important questions, and all philosophers, Christian and non-Christian alike, should try to find out this meaning of life. And the lesson of history, as we come to he was talking about the close of the 20th century and that millennium, but now we're in the new millennium, and still is true, is that we have a path to follow. It is necessary not to abandon the search for ultimate truth. We Christians are getting ready for Holy Week, and we will be hearing on Good Friday. I hope all of you get to church for the services on Good Friday. Don't skip out. Oh, is it a holy day of obligation? No. Should you be there? Yes. It's not second grade. Go there, and you'll hear the words of the patron of, I don't want to say patron saint because he's not a saint, but the patron of the modern world, namely Pontius Pilate, who, as the truth stands in front of him, Pilate says, what is truth? In the most cynical way. That is the modern attitude. You don't want Pontius Pilate to be your model for dealing with the meaning of life. He's a bad model and something that we should not try to imitate. No, we should have a passion for ultimate truth, an eagerness to search for truth, and the audacity to forge new paths in the search for truth. And it is faith which stirs the reason to move beyond all isolation and to run risks. Try to think thoughts beyond what everybody else is doing and run risks in order to attain, and here's the goals. You want to seek what is beautiful, what is good, and what is true. I'll never forget, I was buying a hot dog at an airport one time in a real hurry, so I had to get, and it was the only thing to eat at that terminal. And the guy, was a student. We were talking, he was a student. I said, what are you studying? Art. And I said, when you do art, do it to express what is beautiful, not to express yourself. It's not about you. And he said, no, I got to express who I am. I said, no, people will be bored with who you are. You're selling hot dogs. Instead, seek something beyond you and greater than you, and seek a truth and a beauty. And you will find that people respond to your expression and the way you do it. So we should seek the beautiful, the good, and the true. And faith becomes the convinced and convincing advocate of reason. Faith will not be against the use of the mind. Faith will advocate the use of the mind. And that's what we want to see done. That is the attitude of the Catholic Church toward faith and reason. Faith will encourage the reason to think and discover. That's why, the great astronomers in the past were believers. Copernicus, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, they were all believers. And, this is something that their faith was very much part of what they did. Now we begin a new section of this chapter in which he discusses how the church has its own interest in philosophy. It's paragraph 57. He says, the magisterium doesn't just point out the problems in other people's ideas. That's what a lot of people think of the church. You're just criticizing everything we do. What do you have? And that's why he says that we have a stress, that the magisterium wants to stress the basic principles of a genuine renewal of philosophy and philosophical inquiry, so that we use the tools of the mind to find the meaning of life. The church is eager to promote that. That's why Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical called Aeterni Patris way back in 1879. And in this, it's the one papal document of an encyclical level. There have been other documents, but nothing is as important as this encyclical, Aeterni Patris, that is devoted entirely to philosophy. It's not very long. It's only about 12 pages, single space. So you can read it, get it. Again, you can get that off of our website as well. Just type in Aeterni Patris, and you can get it. It's in English, of course, and from EWTN.com. And what he's trying to do is, as Vatican I, the Vatican I Council did, which was to show the relationship between faith and reason. And he's making the same point. And in that encyclical, he goes through this whole history that we've gone through a little bit in this encyclical about the great thinkers we've had throughout the history of the church who deal with philosophy. In the early centuries, whether it be those who were dealing with apologetics, and refuting the claims of some of the pagans, or whether it be people like St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, and so many others who developed whole new syntheses of thought about the meaning of human life, about God, about the world. And then he promotes all that. And he shows how philosophy very much contributes to faith and theology. That's why it says in Aeterni Patris, paragraph 11, that the learned men, whom we call apologists, that these are the ones who defend the faith, who speedily encountered those teachers of foolish doctrine, and under the guidance of faith, the apologists found arguments in human wisdom also to prove that one God, who stands preeminent in every kind of perfection, is to be worshipped, not the other gods. Matter of fact, when you read the pagan stories of the gods, you see they are not worthy of worship at all, worthy of fear, but not worship or love. And that all things were created from nothing by God's omnipotent power, that by his wisdom all things flourish and serve each their own special purposes. This is what Christianity helps to do. And interestingly enough, unlike pagans who thought of everything in the world as a god, there was a god of the wind, a god of the sea, a god who's the sun, a god of the moon, and so on. Christianity said, no, none of those things are gods. They are all simply creatures, just like you and I are creatures. And therefore, you don't have to worship them or placate them the way pagans do. But you can study them as objects of science. It was Christian faith that truly made science viable. That's why I mentioned earlier, so many of the great scientists, even when they were using rudimentary science, like St. Albert the Great, did so as Christians because they saw, look, everything's made by God. He put it there with his wisdom. He has these laws, and he gave human beings minds that can detect what those laws of nature might be. And we keep learning more and more. This is part of our task. So, now, after well over 100 years, for us now it's 140 years since, 45 years since Pope Leo XIII's letter. Many of the insights of Pope Leo's encyclical still have lost none of their interest from a practical or pedagogical point of view. In other words, it's something that we still need to learn from, and they should help us be better teachers. Especially, we need to pay attention to Pope Leo's insistence on the incomparable value of the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. By the way, you can also download into your computers off the internet all kinds of St. Thomas's writings for free. And this would be a good study for us to do. There is a renewed insistence on the thought of St. Thomas, who is known as the angelic doctor because of the heights to which he went. And to Pope Leo XIII, St. Thomas seemed the best way to recover the practice of philosophy that fits into the demands of the faith. So that, again, as he wrote in Aeterni Patris, Pope Leo said, again, clearly distinguishing, as is fitting, reason from faith, because they're not the same. Reason and faith are distinct, as we've said many times. while happily associating the one with the other. So they're distinct, but not isolated from each other either. St. Thomas both preserved the rights and had regard for the dignity of each. St. Thomas knew the importance of reason and the importance of faith, and he cherished both. And we need to get to his approach. In paragraph 58, the positive results of Pope Leo's summons are well known. Over the next years, many studies of the thought of St. Thomas and of other scholastic theologians like Thomas were begun. There was a great impetus to study them. Historical studies flourished. We discovered the riches of medieval thought, so other medieval writers were also being studied. And there's a use of historical method, going through the various texts of St. Thomas, getting the best copies of his works, knowing more about the history of his life and so on. This really flourished, in the time after Pope Leo. And that knowledge of the works of St. Thomas Aquinas increased greatly. And many scholars had courage enough to introduce the Thomistic tradition into the philosophical and theological discussions of the day. So that, there was a great line, I read a history of American Catholics. And in there was a discussion between a policeman and a guy who worked in a labor union, one of the labor union leaders way back in the 1930s. And they were able to carry on a discussion about a certain moral issue, both based on the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, because Thomas's thought permeated the way Catholics, thought and studied. And so the most influential Catholic theologians of the 20th century, as well as the thought of Vatican II, was very much indebted to this revival of Thomistic philosophy, and that we should study him. And I'm going to make a couple recommendations, besides being able to download some of Thomas's writings from the internet. Someone I have mentioned many times as a great introduction to Thomas's thought is Edward Feser, F-E-S-E-R, Edward Feser. You can either get his book, The Last Superstition, which is one of the best refutations of atheism I've ever seen. But it's also so good because it leads to Thomas Aquinas as the high point of thought. He also has another book of an introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas, also both in paperback. You can look up Edward Feser's books. And then finally, from another interesting perspective, a guest we've had on here quite a number of times is Dr. Anthony Rizzi, R-I-Z-Z-I. Look him up on the internet. And he is a very important physicist, but he also sees the importance of St. Thomas Aquinas in learning how to think and do physics, and to see that the physics that he does on a very high level, as well as Thomas's thought, go together. And you can look up Dr. Rizzi on the internet and check out some of his books as well. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back in just a couple of minutes, and we'll get your questions and your comments, so please stay with us. Thank you very much. And we want to welcome all the folks who have come here from mostly the two Kansas cities, both Missouri and Kansas. I understand there was a rumble on the bus. Is that right? Over the football teams, is that right? No, they were very nice. And folks from a few other places, Albuquerque and elsewhere. And we'd love to have you come and join us too. It's kind of pretty down here, isn't it? And it's just absolutely beautiful. The red buds are still in blossom, and the pear trees, their leaves are starting to come out. The tulip trees in blossom, forsythia and tulips, and all kinds of flowers are coming out now, and it's very pretty. So if you can, call our pilgrimage department at 205-271-2966. Or go to the website EWTN.com to get some more information about that. And also want to make an announcement that I just have a brand new book that came out yesterday. It's called Mary, Virgin, Mother, and Queen. It's a Bible study about the Blessed Virgin Mary and, in the scriptures. Both Old and New Testaments, and also about why do we pray to Mary, things like that, biblically based, okay? So we encourage you to get that. You can go to EWTNreligiouscatalog.com and order it there, or you can call them 1-800-854-6316. In a month, we'll be having May celebrations. That's a good time to get started and be prepared for that as well. And also, while we're still in Lent, you may want to take a look at another book from Religious Catalog called Go in Peace, which is about 101 questions on confession. The answer to it is go. All right, let's now go to it. We have a caller first. Hello, George, you're on the line.
Hi, Father.
Hi, where are you from?
Love your show. I
Thanks.
love you, and I pray for you.
Oh, I need that.
And and I wanted to ask you about this movie, Noah.
Sure.
Now, I didn't see it, but I saw reviews that said it was sacrilegious, and somebody told me who saw it that there were like robots in it, that somehow that was a reference to these demons and mating with human beings.
Right,
Can you
George.
tell me about all that?
Well, George, I saw the movie last Thursday night. It opened here in Birmingham Thursday, and so I went to see it. And two initial responses are that I started to laugh at some of it because it was silly. For instance, just historically, the flood is something that occurred, at the end of the last ice age, which is the beginning of the Neolithic period. That is the new Stone Age. And maybe could have gone on to the Chalcolithic period. However, the movie says that the reason for the flood is that people had brought in industrialization. No, I'm sorry, honey, that was the 1800s AD. And this, and they're wearing leather instead of, maybe, and people didn't know how to do tanning of leather yet. There was metal and iron tools. None of that was around. They didn't even know how to make pottery back in those days. So that's silly. And then, in addition, the Bible story about Noah and the ark is 4 chapters long. There's some very significant elements there. And one of the big issues is that unlike the pagans who also taught the flood story, the flood is taught all around the world. I don't know if you knew this, but the Winnebago Indians of Wisconsin had a flood story. The Northwest Coast Indians of North America also had a flood story. The Aborigines and people all over Asia and the Mediterranean world and Europe had the flood story. They took that as much for granted as we take the Big Bang Theory. Now, just, of course, because at the end of the Ice Age, you had all this melting of snow. I mean, think of this. Chicago had a mile-high glacier, and that is a bigger snow job than even the politicians are able to accomplish. So this is something that, that they had going on. And when you have a mile-high glacier melting, what are you going to get? I mean, if you have a foot of snow melt, you get floods. So, of course, there's going to be flooding and the various evidences of that. So, but it had nothing to do with a punishment for industrialization. Rather, what the Bible makes clear is that people were punished for their wickedness that was in their hearts, and that the wickedness came from within them, and that Noah was exempted because of all the people on the earth. He was righteous and blameless, and they couldn't find anybody else. That was key. And in this movie, and this is one of the most egregious things about it, Noah believes in the movie that God wants to have the animals live, but all the human beings die, because even he and his family still are not 100% good. So he only has his wife, who's elderly, and his son married a woman who was unable to have children. And then when his grandfather heals her, which again, nothing to do with the Bible at all, but in the Bible, Noah was told to bring his sons and their wives. But in this version, only one son brings his wife, and Noah lets the other guy's girlfriend die in the flood. And then when his daughter-in-law gives birth to twin daughters, he has a knife over the baby's skull, and he's like this, shaking to kill the baby, and say, that ain't my Bible. It has nothing to do with my Bible. And here's where I find it most egregious, is that Noah feels empathy for the child, and his human kindness overwhelms his willingness to obey God, whom he believes wanted him to kill it. Now, this is such a distortion. When we live in a world where it is the unbelievers, the anti-Christians, and the non-Christians, or Christians who have fallen away from their Christian faith, who believe that it's okay to drive scissors into the skull of a baby and do that kind of abortion even after it's born, yet alone abortion in the womb. And here they twist it to make it that God wants them to do that, and that his human empathy stops him. Now this is twisted, totally. And God did not want a paradise for the animals. As a matter of fact, that was another thing that made me laugh. I've been out in the woods a lot over the years. And somebody who thinks that the animals are always so sweet and so kind and gentle has only seen them when they're in cages in zoos or in Disney cartoons, because that's not the way they act in nature by any means. And I mean, I'm not just talking about the lions taking down their prey, even among deer and other, they're mean to each other. They're just downright mean when it gets to be mating season. So, again, it was somebody who had it all seemed so superficial, an approach to philosophy, history, anthropology, human or animal life, all that. So I didn't like it. All right, let's go to a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm Jan Rector from Olathe, Kansas.
And your question?
My question is, with St. Thomas Aquinas, what were some of the proofs that he had that God existed?
Ooh. All right, what were they? He had 5 proofs, and to go through them would take 2 shows. I mean, because they're very rich. What I may do is down the road come do a show with that. I'd like to have Dr. Facer come on my show and do that. But he does have a number of proofs. One, very simply, is that everything exists out of nothing. Now, this is the basis for the Big Bang Theory as well, and that everything exists out of nothing. Someone had to be the cause of that everything coming out of nothing. Nothing cannot produce anything. That's just not logical. That out of complete emptiness, something could start. There must be a prime mover, someone who begins it. And it goes on, but that would be one of the very basic proofs. And that's a very quick summary of it. But we'll do a whole show or two, because it's not the kind of thing that you just summarize. It's very rich, but also something that takes a little time to think through. And we'll have to go through some of that. But that's one of them. And again, Dr. Facer certainly has that. We have another question here. Caller. Hello, Doris?
Yes, Father.
Hi. Where are you from?
Can you hear me?
Sure. Where are you from?
I'm calling, excuse me, I'm calling from New York.
Okay.
My prayer is that God may bless you and protect you always, always.
Well, I need that. Mm-hmm.
Father, when I was a little girl, I learned about the God of Moses, Abraham, and he was a very angry God. In fact, if you broke any of the commandments right away, their sentence was that you would be smited. And I want to know how, in the New Testament, how our God, the same God, became so loving and so good and so patient. And like, for example, if it would have been the God of old when Obama went to see the Holy Father, I think he would have been smoted right there, right? I would hope. But the thing is
that is above my pay grade to make those kind of decisions.
This is one way that I learned how to be careful and not break any commandments, because you kind of more are afraid of an angry God than a loving God. Mm-hmm. And I want to know how our God became like everything goes, anything goes.
All right. Now, Doris, stay on a second. I have a question for you. Did you have any children?
I have a son.
Okay. Did your son grow up?
Hello?
Yeah. Did your son grow up?
My son is going to be 20.
Okay, good. Great. Now, was there ever a time, as he was a very small boy, that you had to tell him, if you go into that street, I will spank you? Did you ever have to tell him that?
No, I didn't. I never let go of his hand.
Oh. All right, well, my mom let me go, and she made it clear. If you go into that street, I'll tan your hide. All right? Because I was so little, the cars can't see you and all that kind of stuff. So I was afraid of my parents, even though I wanted to play in the street, because it looked like a big empty place. And there weren't many of those things inside Chicago. So, but then later on, you realize, that Mom and Dad were not being mean. It's at the moment, it seems they never let me do anything, and I want to play in the street, and they don't let me. They're mean. Isn't that the way it is with, and you can think of all kinds of other things that you did. Whereas, when you get older, you realize, especially when your mother's prayers are answered, and you have a child who is just like you were, and you see how careful and loving your mother was in giving you those strict limits, and how gentle and loving, well, not always gentle, as I learned the hard way, but how your father, in enforcing that in our house, made it clear that, you realize later on they're saving your life. But at the time you're a little kid, they just seem mean. They don't let me do anything. And when you're a teenager, it's even can be worse. Because then they really see me. They don't let me do anything all the other kids are doing. And you hear about, things like, well, if the other kids jump off a bridge, right? All this, everybody heard these things. And we learn later on that they were wise. And part of it is the same way in the Old Testament. First of all, Doris, read more carefully the Bible itself. Look how it says that the Lord wants you to love him with his whole heart, mind, and soul. In the book of Deuteronomy, that is repeated many times. But there also is a point at which, when you are immature, that you only can see that God doesn't let us do this, and I'm scared, so I better not do that. But later on, you mature. And this is where Christ comes in to a level of greater maturity. The nation of Israel matured as a society over the centuries. They went from being a semi-nomadic tribe living in the desert of the Sinai after years of slavery into eventually becoming a very civilized society. And they learned, sometimes the hard way, but they learned slowly and gradually. And then when Christ comes, then he can be, show another side of love. But he also makes it very clear. Look at the parables about the kingdom of God in Matthew 13, but elsewhere as well. That he will cast the bad fish into the fire and keep the good. He will put the weeds into the fire, and the wheat he will gather into barns. Christ also makes it clear that those who are wicked will be punished by him too. So it's not completely gone, but there's a deeper dimension. And that's what we have to look at, just like we do at our parents as we mature. God willing, we do. All right, we have another question from our studio audience. Father, where are you from?
I'm originally from New Orleans, but I'm working in St. Joseph, Missouri.
Good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. The comment I wanted to make was Pope Francis, of course, we appreciate him because he has a great emphasis on charity and helping the poor, and which is wonderful, and a great also an outlook on sinners and greater compassion. It's also seeing your talk about Fides et Ratio. It's very interesting to see the previous pontiffs speaking about truth, objective truth. And it's also good to see that Pope Francis, in his first writing in July of this past year, he also makes reference to this. So he speaks about this charity, but he says it cannot be separated from truth.
Right.
And so I think that's a very beautiful way to interpret Pope Francis's approach, because he himself is also saying, well, we can't separate ourselves from truth, because it's like charity without truth is like a fish without water.
Right. And, you also, and we have to be careful that we don't let the agenda of our popular media block out the fact that Pope Benedict had done his first encyclical on God is love. And that he also never saw truth isolated from charity and love. But also keep in mind too, that Pope Francis, who just celebrated Mass with victims of the mafia in Italy, And he also very clearly warned and said to the people in the mafia, if you do not change your ways, you will end up in hell. Now, once again, letting somebody know of the reality of hell is charitable. You let them know this is the effect of what you're doing will lead to. And that's not mean. It's mean if you see somebody's behavior is like the boat going towards the great big waterfall. And you just say, oh, hi, can I get a picture before you go off? That's the way the modern media is. They want to take photographs as it gets there, and then you get on MTV. But this is not what we are to do. We're to say, hey, get out of that boat. You're headed for disaster. And that's what Pope Francis, and you don't hear the media say that he told the mafia that they can go to hell if they don't change their ways of life. So this is something that we also have to pay attention to, the balance. Just like as parents, all of you were balanced, God willing. We have another caller. Hello, Carmen, you're on the air.
Hello, Father. How are you?
Fine, where are you from?
I'm from Richmond, Virginia.
Great, and it's good to have you. And what's your question?
Father, I'll just be brief. I just want to know, when I get into a discussion with my non-Catholic friends, we get into like purgatory, and I really don't know what should be the correct answer or Bible references to purgatory.
Oh, that's very easy. First of all, one of the things I'm going to recommend, Carmen, is that you get a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because it'll have those references, both from history and the Bible. And I think you can get that online too. I think so. So that you can just look it up in your computer. Secondly, where we see a number of references are to 1 Peter chapter 3, I think verse 19 and 20, where he says that Jesus' soul went down to preach to the souls in prison. Now that's not hell as the inferno, and certainly not heaven. It's to these souls who died before his saving death. And he preached to them to get them out of that prison. And that would be St. Peter's use of the word purgatory. And then in the gospel, in Matthew chapter 5, right on verse 25 and 26, our Lord says, make friends with your enemy on the way to the judge, or else he will hand you over to the judge will hand you over to the jail, and you'll be kept into prison until you pay the last penny. Now, the same word for prison, by the way. And the idea there, too, is, and this was used by the fathers of the church, to indicate that you can pay that last penny and get out. So that's something else. So take a look at the Catechism, and you'll see some of that there, okay? I have another real quick question. Sir,
Yes,
where are
Father.
you from?
Father, you mentioned relativism a while ago, and I just recently read The Dynamic Catholic, and he talked about that, and I guess
That's
it's
by
more of a
Matthew Kelly, correct?
yes,
Yes.
and I guess it's just made me aware of what's around me more so. And
Yes, it's good. Yeah, Matthew Kelly's book, The Dynamic Catholic, brings up this issue of relativism that permeates our culture. And I don't know if it's at our religious catalog, but I bet it is. And because I know Matthew Kelly is going to be a guest on the show later this year. So, yeah, it's very important to be alert to the way in which the culture is opting towards relativism. But it's usually as a way to hide that they are going to try and force you to do their way. For instance, the president trying to force Christians to pay for abortion pills and contraception. So we have to stand up to that. But we cannot stand up to the absolute truth that we're running out of time. So may the Lord bless you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Again, I want to remind you this network is brought to you by you. So please keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill. And we will pay our bills too. Thank you, and God bless.